I call order. I'm calling Catherine Delahunty, 5 minutes.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koutou te whare ko tēnei pō. It's a sad moment because despite the soothing noises and the legal arguments and all the coziness that some people are claiming, it's clear to me that this legislation is being supported by people who've never experienced surveillance. And that the people who are actually going to experience the surveillance, who came before you or have already experienced it, have a reason to understand the term moral ambiguity. I'd like to focus on that very word because moral ambiguity is what the conflict in the Middle East has been characterised and is fuelling ISIL. Moral ambiguity from the Western powers, whose weapons of supposed mass destruction and their blatant politics of oil, not the politics of an ethical stance, has allowed the Allies to support various violent regimes, some extremely misogynist, when it suits the Western powers. And when it suits the Western powers, legislation like this will be passed. So let's not pretend that we're operating in some independent little country virtuous cycle of self-responsibility. This is about Five Eyes, and this is what the Americans want us to do, and so we're doing it. If that's not moral ambiguity, I don't know what it is. And I'd like to remind people of some citizens of this country who've experienced the SIS and their capacity to be morally ambiguous. Mr. Ahmed Zawi, a gentleman that I happen to know who was put in solitary confinement because he was supposedly connected with terrorism because the French didn't like him. So he did 5 years and it cost $3 million for his name to be cleared. And this man had no connection. He was a member of parliament in his own country and a non-violent person, had no connection with violence, but nevertheless ended up rotting in a cell inside New Zealand. And the powers that be, the SAS, right up to the Prime Minister of the day, refused to look at the evidence. And so that's how safe we feel about what can happen in this country. I'd like to talk about my friend Benny Wenza, who wasn't allowed to speak in this parliament, a West Papuan who was on the red list for Interpol. Interpol put him on their red list for no other reason than the Indonesians had framed him. And so information from other countries about these so-called people who need to be on red lists or be in solitary confinement or who are terrorists, they can suffer a huge price. And this bill will allow that. So despite all the reassurances that we're only going to be dealing with the bad people, because of course the world is divided neatly into good and bad people, we all know that in this house, don't we? What is actually happening is a low trust model, and we're being asked to trust something that has not yet proven to be trustworthy, i.e. the SAS, let alone the Minister of the day having control over the SAS. And I think the points were well made that the committee of this House that makes decisions around the SAS is a failed committee, and that if there was so much that was heard by the select committee about how dangerous it all was, my colleague Dr. Kennedy Graham, he heard all that evidence too. Somehow he wasn't swayed into a state of paranoia. Somehow he didn't think it was necessary to forego human rights and civil liberties in this legislation. Somehow he managed to maintain a sense of proportion in the face of a disproportionate piece of legislation that is not convincing and has not convinced many, many people. So it is very disappointing when you know how surveillance works to hear people talk as if only the bad people are at risk. 1 minute, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we are proud to stand on our record of peacemakers because this bill will not make peace. It will not make anyone safer. It has already made people less safe in this country because Muslim people are being targeted and they are being abused because of the government having to create the hyperbole to pass the legislation. So that's very disturbing, not to mention how much surveillance you can do in 24 hours. Tamaiti told us about the surveillance that was in his bathroom, the devices that were put in his bathroom. The SAS and others will do these things. And people here think, oh, it won't happen to them. But for people like myself, for whom we have experienced surveillance, we know that this is not about all New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker. This is wrong, this is a betrayal, and this is an abuse of human rights.
I call David Seymour, 5 minutes.
Mr Speaker, I rise on behalf